When German tanks crossed the border of France in 1940, they crushed the Allied forces in their path. While everyone expected the start of a long and hard conflict, like in the First World War, no one imagined what was actually going to happen. The Nazis, using their new doctrine of Blitzkrieg, mercilessly wiped out their enemies. Cities fell so fast that their inhabitants did not even have time to flee. Adolf Hitler and his generals were determined to show the entire world the power of their war machine and would not stop until Paris was under their control. That is why today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you every moment of France's crushing defeat in the Second World War. Get ready for a brutal and colorful delivery. When the First World War came to an end on November 11, 1918, the defeated German Empire was pointed out by the victors as the main culprit of the conflict. Because of this, and through the Treaty of Versailles signed in 1919, Germany suffered extremely severe punishments, both in the social and political spheres, as well as in the military. For example, they were forced to pay exorbitant amounts of money to countries such as the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, which left the German nation in ruins for years. They also had to cede large areas of territory to the European victors, including all of their colonies in Asia and Africa. Their once powerful army, which had had almost 1 million troops, was reduced to just 100,000 soldiers and was prohibited from possessing artillery, tanks, airplanes, and submarines. All of these clauses were seen by many, including some of the victors, as excessive. The chaos and discontent they provoked in Germany led to the dissolution of its empire and the establishment of a republic. But they also helped to give rise to numerous figures who denounced the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles from the outset. The most important of these was undoubtedly Adolf Hitler. He blamed the victors for the current tragic situation of German citizens and took advantage of the resentment caused by this pact to rise politically. In just a few years, his National Socialist Party had gained hundreds of thousands of members, and by 1933 he had already seized power. However, it was not long before the now Führer almost completely ignored the points of the Treaty of Versailles. In 1935, he began a massive rearmament program through which conscription was re-established. In just a few months, the 100,000 soldiers that made up the German forces multiplied in number. But Hitler did not stop there.
Deutsche Friedensheer ist aufgestellt. Eine gewaltige deutsche Luftwaffe beschützt unsere Heimat. Eine neue Macht zur Sieg unserer Küsten. Inmitten der gigantischen Steigerung unserer allgemeinen Produktion wurde es möglich, eine Aufrüstung ohne Grenzen fortzuführen.
War industries began building aircraft and artillery again, and shipyards began building ships and submarines. However, Hitler's priority was armored vehicles. He was convinced that future wars would be defined by tank power, and he wanted to ensure that Germany was at the forefront of this field. The other powers of Europe, such as the United Kingdom and France, while not approving of what the Nazi leader was doing, did not oppose it either. The leaders of these countries maintained a policy of appeasement, believing that by allowing Hitler political and economic concessions, they could prevent a major conflict. They did not even protest on 12 March 1938, when German army troops peacefully entered Austria and announced their annexation, in clear defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. Neville Chamberlain, then the British Prime Minister, classified the operation as inevitable, arguing that there was no way to intervene without dragging Europe into a new conflict. But Hitler's ambitions did not end in Austria. In October 1938, the German Third Reich invaded the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia without encountering armed resistance, using the excuse of protecting the Germans living there. Once again, the other powers offered only weak protests. Emboldened, the Führer began to direct the fury of his guns towards another of his neighbors, Poland. However, unlike the countries that were now part of the Nazi Empire, the Poles were going to fight for their right to autonomy. This time, the United Kingdom, France, and their allies also made it clear that if Hitler advanced his territorial claims, there would be war. However, the German leader, accustomed to the passivity with which they had previously faced him, turned a deaf ear. On the 1st of September 1939, German tanks crossed the border that separated them from Poland. In addition to increasing his territorial conquests, Hitler was looking for a setting to test his new weapons of war and demonstrate his power to the world. Following brutal artillery barrages, German armored vehicles advanced alongside infantry units, while aircraft soared through the skies to support them. The Polish defenses, which did not have the technological advances that the Reich had achieved in recent years, could do nothing to stop their advance. However, it was not all good news for Hitler. On the 3rd of September, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany, showing that their threats had not been empty. Although this was the first obstacle to the advance of Nazism, the conquest of Poland continued. In just 1 month, the forces that resisted signed the surrender, and the Third Reich increased its size considerably. The new strategies used by the German armies had taken effect, but they were still evolving. Hitler's generals thought that they could improve their performance even more. They would soon have the opportunity to prove it. The months that followed the German victory were relatively calm. Both the Nazis and the newly formed Allied side focused on organizing their forces and arming them for the battles to come. France knew that they were surely next on Hitler's list due to their geographical proximity, but they were still calm, although expectant of the next steps of the Nazi forces. Their army had more than 2.5 million soldiers, as well as fast and maneuverable armored vehicles. In addition, along their entire border with Germany was the powerful Maginot Line. This was a system of concrete fortifications and bunkers armed with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. A great defensive wall that would keep the enemy out of the country. At least that is what their generals believed. Despite the notable capabilities of the French forces, their tactics had not changed much since World War I. Tanks had a secondary role, and even cavalry units were still used in important roles. The High Command maintained that the mobility of animals was preferable to the power of armored machines, although the events in Poland had already shown how outdated this doctrine was. The French thought that the fighting would again tend towards battles of attrition, as had happened in the previous global conflict. The Germans, however, had other plans. On 10th May 1940, German troops began a massive invasion of their enemies, but France was not the only one affected. Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland also saw Nazi tanks cross their borders and begin to enter their territory. It was an unprecedented operation, the scale of which took the Allies by surprise. The British Expeditionary Force and a large part of the French army immediately headed for the Ardennes region of Belgium, thinking that this would be the main attack. But the Germans were counting on this, and once the Allies reached their objective, they diverted their tanks towards France. In this way, they completely avoided the Maginot Line, which did not extend over the German-Belgian border. The local generals, however, were not overly concerned. They were convinced that the dense forests and difficult terrain of their country would complicate the Nazi advance enough for them to reorganize their troops and be able to counterattack. But the German preparation had been sublime.
The French High Command was driven by hope rather than reality, and they believed that the Ardennes were impassable, but the Germans had done their homework. Radio assets were used to very great effect, and together with a great plan and also very bold leadership, it allowed them to pass armoured vehicles through the Ardennes with great speed, far more quickly than anybody had ever expected.
The commanders of the German armored units had studied the enemy terrain perfectly and managed to move at incredible speed, covering 160 kilometers in a single day. To understand the magnitude of this feat, distances that should have taken them 10 days were covered in just 3. The French had no chance to prepare their defenses for what was to come. They were about to fall victim to a lethal example of Blitzkrieg. It all began with a brutal artillery barrage on the local troops that sowed chaos among their lines. Simultaneously, German planes bombed their rivals' airfields, eliminating any possibility of an air threat. Then, when they were already in complete disarray, the mixed infantry and tank units advanced. But instead of the support role to which the Allies limited the armored ships, the Germans concentrated all this power on the attack points. They worked in perfect synchronicity, with the sole objective of quickly destroying their enemy, completely denying them the chance to reorganize. Although the French and British vehicles were superior in armament to the German ones, thousands of them were destroyed during this campaign.
The French soldiers are psychologically devastated.
The attack was far worse than my imagination could have invented. The explosions were so frequent, you could not distinguish between individual bomb blasts. I was deaf and could hardly breathe. I made myself as small as possible, my world shaking. I sobbed.
In the first days of the German offensive, the Allies suffered enormous casualties. Not only that, but the German attacks shattered the idea of superiority that many Frenchmen held. Several officers realized that their tactics had become completely outdated, crushed under the heavy tracks of enemy tanks. After great Nazi victories, such as that which occurred at the Battle of Sedan in northern France on May 15, 1940, the Germans continued their advance. While part of their forces continued their march westward, others headed north to isolate their opponents. Within this trap were more than 1 million allies, including British, French, and Belgians. Winston Churchill, who had replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister, ordered his generals to begin devising plans for a massive evacuation of English forces. But for this, they would need time, which they did not seem to have. The German battleships continued to advance at a good pace towards their objectives. At this point, the Allies had a sudden stroke of good luck. Surprisingly, it came from within Nazism itself. Hitler, despite his triumphs, began to feel nervous. He thought that his tanks had advanced too far, leaving the infantry behind, and would therefore be easy prey for his enemy's counterattacks. In addition, Hermann Göring, the leader of the German Air Force, convinced him that his planes alone would be enough to destroy the enemy. So it was that on the brink of victory, the German High Command ordered its battleships to stop and rejoin the foot soldiers. While the vehicle crews were able to take advantage of a respite from the fighting, the unit commanders were furious. They felt that the victory of the war was about to slip through their fingers due to Göring's hunger for glory and his Führer's indecision. Churchill and his military advisors also took advantage of the enemy's slowdown. Concluding that France was lost, they began planning its evacuation. They chose the port of Dunkirk as the point where this desperate operation would take place and ordered all their men to go there as quickly as possible. They would not have much time. Göring, wanting to keep his promise, concentrated all his efforts on destroying the city. His planes constantly bombed the Allies, killing many of them. But the Germans were not the only ones reaping victories in the skies. British Royal Air Force planes also killed a large number of German pilots. The Nazi commander's attempts were not enough to prevent English ships from approaching the French coast and beginning to evacuate soldiers from May 26, 1940. Even civilian ships, such as fishing boats without any weapons, volunteered to assist the uniformed men. For 8 days, the Allies fought Nazi aircraft day and night. Many were riddled with vehicle guns, and a large number of ships were destroyed by bombs. However, when the evacuation ended on June 4th, the British considered it a success.
Over 16,000 French and British troops died during the evacuation. The dead buried by their comrades in arms. With the fleeing expeditionary force abandoning nearly all of its tanks, vehicles, and equipment. But thanks to the unremitting bravery of the crews of the Navy, the little ships, and the RAF, 340,000 Allied soldiers are rescued. Many more than the 40,000 that were expected to be saved.
For the Germans, the evacuation of Dunkirk was a complete failure, as the opportunity to deal a mortal blow to the Allies was lost. Many consider it to this day one of Adolf Hitler's greatest mistakes. However, the war was not over. The battle for France continued. The Nazis' next objective was Paris, their capital. The already battered French soldiers tried to hold back the brutal enemy advance, but were unable to do so. The tactics employed by their tanks were vastly inferior to the German Blitzkrieg doctrine, and they were soon completely overwhelmed. Any point that tried to be defended was destroyed by Nazi aircraft and battleships. Tens of thousands of soldiers died, and many others, thinking that all was lost, deserted. The inhabitants of the cities, overwhelmed by the speed of the Third Reich's attacks, did not have time to escape from their advance, and large numbers of them were captured. When the last defensive lines of Paris fell, the French generals, wanting to prevent its destruction, declared the capital an open city. This meant that its defenders would surrender without resistance. This happened on June 14, 1940, when German divisions entered the streets of Paris without being fired upon. Although the capital had fallen, the battle for France continued for a few more days in the regions near the Maginot Line. But the defenders, completely isolated and outnumbered, could not offer resistance for long. On June 25, 1940, Marshal Philippe Pétain, in charge of the French forces, signed the surrender of his country. On Hitler's orders, the ceremony was held in the same place where Germany had signed the capitulation at the end of the First World War.
Hitler demands that victory becomes a huge propaganda event.
Hitler sought to obliterate the memory of the defeat of Germany in 1918, one that was very painful for him and for the wider German nation. On entering Paris, the Germans wasted no time in branding it their own. Monuments, particularly those that were relevant to the French success in the First World War, were initially draped in the swastika flag and then eventually destroyed.
The country was divided in two. One region was occupied by the Nazis, while in another, the puppet state of Vichy France was established, who would be loyal to the regime of the Third Reich. In just 6 weeks, one of the powers of Europe had been completely defeated thanks to the new and devastating German Blitzkrieg. With the loss of its ally, the United Kingdom was now the only opponent to the Führer's empire. But the large number of casualties suffered in this campaign made a quick counterattack impossible. For many, this was undoubtedly the darkest moment of the entire Second World War. We've reached the end of this video, and we want to ask you, how do you think the war would have changed if the British had not been able to evacuate Dunkirk? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.